May the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts, and the actions of our lives be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Hello, Trinitarians. In our Gospel from Matthew today, we encounter Jesus engaged in yet another interrogation by the religious authorities of his day. The Pharisees have gathered again to test him in an attempt to shut down his movement, which has begun to pose a threat to their way of life, their power and intellectual authority as the ultimate interpreters and practitioners of the Jewish law. In an attempt to lure him into making an evaluative judgment between the 613 laws found within the Torah, a lawyer amongst them asked Jesus, "Teacher, which commandments in the law is the greatest?" At this point in the gospel story, Jesus is quickly approaching the cross and his time to teach is running short. Here, the gospel's author takes another opportunity for Jesus to make explicit the essential core of his teaching. While asked for one great commandment, Jesus responds with two. First, he replies with what would have been a fairly expected answer. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. Here, Jesus is quoting the Shema from Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And then Jesus quickly continues that there is a second just like it. Not a second that follows after the first, or merely one that is similar, but a second that is equal to and inseparable from the first. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Here, Jesus is paraphrasing from Leviticus 19, which we just heard read. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Instead of falling into the trap of evaluating and debating the laws, Jesus takes the opportunity to distill and make clear the kernel of truth at the center of every law and the inspiration behind every prophet. He gives us the hermeneutical key to interpreting the Hebrew Scriptures. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The Bible is not a storybook. It is not a page-turning vacation companion or comforting bedtime story to be heard and tucked away until the next evening. It is demanding, and it can change our life if we let it. In these 3 lines, Jesus makes clear what we are called to do. We are commanded to love God, to love our neighbor, to love ourselves. This is our essential reason for being and purpose as Christians. And as essential workers for God's mission of love in the world, we have to start by clarifying what it means to love. Jesus, as our epistemology, our greatest way of knowing God's nature, makes it clear that this love is not a sappy matter of feeling that flows from our own enjoyment, which is how we tend to think about love as a culture. Instead, throughout his life, death, and resurrection, Jesus makes it clear that this commandment love is a spiritual discipline, a way of life that takes both commitment and effort. Love, as we have come to know the nature of God, is understood as an unconditional commitment and action towards relationship. There is always to be an object and recipient of our love. Love is directional and it is to radiate. We are to love God, we are to love our neighbor, and we are to love ourselves. And as a commandment of love, our vocation as Christians is to respond in obedience, another buzzword that needs interpretation. For the month of October, we have been exploring this Christian practice of obedience at Deaconess Ann House. In this program, our young adults explore Benedictine spirituality and the rule of St. Benedict, which is built upon the 3 pillars of obedience, stability, and conversion of life. The Benedictine way of interpreting and understanding Christian obedience reaches back to its Latin root word, obedire, which means to listen. Benedictine obedience is the ability to listen, hear, and respond in love to the voice of God, speaking through one another and the demands of community life. For Saint Benedict of Nursia, who lived in Italy and established the rule for living in community during the last days of the Roman Empire, the Christian life was not to be a series of spiritual athletics done in solitary confinement. He knew very well that our spiritual growth happens in the midst of responding to the promptings of God experienced in community. Benedictine sister Joan Chittister helps us further understand the intricate and inseparable tie between loving God and loving our neighbor in her commentary upon the Rule of Benedict. She explains that as we turn to love God, we must turn to love our neighbor because the human is the only place we can really be sure that God is. It is so easy to love the God that we do not see, but it is so much more sanctifying to serve the God we learn to see in others. It is easy to love in the abstract, but when we are called to put love into action and respond to the needs of people and the world in our midst, the real challenge of obedience to our vocation as essential workers shows up. Our essential work of loving relationship is messy. It is the business of welcoming interruptions, and risk always comes with involvement. But Jesus makes it clear later in the Gospel of Matthew that if we want a relationship with Him, we are to respond to the hungry, to the thirsty, the stranger and the naked, the sick and the one who is in prison. Because as we respond to the least of these, we respond to Jesus in our midst. To do this essential work well, it quickly becomes apparent that we do need stability, which is the second pillar of the Benedictine way. In practicing stability, we come to know and trust that while the troubles and oppositions of the world are temporary, the good news and faithfulness of God's love is not, and our job of moving the world towards beloved community instead of chaos remains pressing. In stability, we cultivate a practice to listen for the voice of God and to pay attention for those in our midst who need God's love. Obedience with stability enables us to do this essential work that we are called and commanded to do, work that is especially needed during these chaotic times of deep political divide and mandates to remain separated. These hard days have a lot of potential for conversion of life, the third pillar of Benedictine spirituality, especially as we respond as essential workers communicating God's love to the world. We have all been thrown into a steep time of reimagining our ways, and it is exhausting to always be using our imaginations. So here is where we can help each other. Without the familiar structures and the ways of being in relationship with God and our neighbors, in what new ways are you helping others find relationship with God? How are you helping others find relationship with each other? How have you been communicating God's love to the world during these days of separation? I invite you to leave your practices in the comments. Siblings, may God give you the grace not to sell yourself short, grace to risk something big for something good, grace to remember that the world is now too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. So may God take your minds and think through them. May God take your lips and speak through them. May God take your hearts and set them on fire. In the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen.